Hey, what's going on, fam? So this is going to be another quick video talking about how the China virus exposes or further exposes Pan Babblism. The reason why I want to talk about this or make this topic today is because, as you guys know, I've made the last two videos about the treatment of Africans in China. And as I make this video, you'll see how that was somewhat due to the fact that we're showing Pan Babblers and Africans how it's done, how you stand up for people of the diaspora, and how you consider and understand that anti-black racism applies to all people of African descent, no matter what their current nationality is. But not only because of that, but because obviously foundational black Americans, we experience a lot of the same type of anti-black racism coming from Asians who are located in America. And we know that some of the black Americans that are over there in China are getting the same treatment as Africans, even though there's a lot more Africans over there than black Americans. Some of the few black Americans that are over there are getting some of the same treatment that Africans are getting in China. Um, and though really the only black Americans that are not getting that treatment are basketball players, that because China just loves their basketball players. So that's probably really the only people that's not getting mistreated by um, the Chinese government and the Chinese citizens in China. The only black people. That and maybe somebody who's in a high level government position or something, but are working in some kind of position that's of importance to China. Like, yeah, I don't know if there's some software engineer or something, they may not get the treatment, but a lot of them are getting the treatment regardless of what position they're in. So anyway, that's I digress. Point is that black people are all, regardless of nationality, are pretty much all getting the same treatment from the Chinese and the Chinese government. Um, and so for that reason, when it comes to that issue, addressing or trying to take the approach of telling Africans to hold their own nuts with the Chinese is not really a wise strategy for Black Americans, because it applies to us as well. The same thing that they're doing to the Chinese, they would do to us, and it's basically for the same motivations, which is anti-Black racism. So it's appropriate for us to speak up against the treatment of the Africans in China, because we get the same treatment in America from Asians, and we need to constantly remind ourselves, because so many of us are infected with the kumbaya mentality. We need to be constantly beating the drum with proof of how dangerous the kumbaya mentality is by using examples like the treatment of Africans in China, along with the treatment of the way we're treated by Asians in America, and also the way we're treated by all these other non-black, non-white groups, but also including the way we're all treated by white people. So all these other non-black groups, including white people, but including all the other non-white, non-black groups, um, we need to continually highlight our mistreatment by these groups to show how dangerous and poisonous the non-white kumbaya mentality is. Just because we're all non-white does not mean we need to be kumbaya with each other, because these groups have no kumbaya with us, and we see that by the treatment of Africans in China. So with that being said, and the fact that we all do have this mutual plight of anti-black racism from all non-black groups, it still doesn't excuse the fact that Africans neglect us and disrespect us. As a matter of fact, in some ways, it makes it even worse that Africans would neglect and disrespect us, because they should understand us and understand our plight better than anyone else, since they experience it also, which is anti-black racism. They should know and be the most sympathetic to us, but they're not, and not all of them. Again, this is not every single African or every single Caribbean. There are many rider Caribbeans and many rider Africans, but for the most part, they are not riders. Not for us, maybe for themselves, but definitely not for us, and really even not for themselves. Honestly, that's why Africa's colonialized to death. So they're really not even for themselves, but damn sure not for us. Um, and again, not all. Some of them are, but most of them are not. They're exclusive to themselves, and they neglect us and disrespect us. And again, if anything, it makes it worse because you should understand and know what we're going through better than anyone else. Um, so it makes it even worse that you would have almost the same mentality of anti-black racism towards black Americans that all these other groups have towards black Americans and you. So what I'm going to do, fam, to further illustrate my point about how Africans neglect us, because one of the biggest things that we talked about was um, when we were debating the Pan Babblers was how African governments don't reach out to us, and we would make this point to them, and they would deflect it with, "Oh, the African government, they can't do it," or whatever. They would make excuses for the African government. They were really what they would say is, "Oh, there's no such thing as an African government because all African governments are controlled by the white man. That's why they don't stand up when you're mistreated." So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read not the whole article. Even I'm going to put the whole article, the link to the whole article in the description box. So anyone who wants to read the whole article in full context, you can. And I'm providing you a quick link to it in the description box. But I'm not going to read the whole article because the whole article is not. It's not necessary to read the whole article and unnecessarily extend this video. So I'm only going to read a couple paragraphs from the article, and then I'm going to talk about it and talk about why I'm using these paragraphs and the example they show. So this article is titled, one moment here, Beijing faces a diplomatic crisis after report of mistreatment of Africans in China causes outrage. And this is from CNN. All right. And again, I'm not reading the whole article, so I'm starting from a paragraph that's kind of in the middle of the article. In Africa, however, governments and media outlets and citizens reacted angrily to the apparent rise in anti-foreigner sentiment as videos of Africans being harassed by police, sleeping on the streets, or being locked into their homes under quarantine circulated online. On Saturday, the front page of Kenya's biggest newspaper led with the headline, Kenyans in China, rescue us from hell, as a member of the country's parliament called for Chinese nationals to leave Kenya immediately. Again, on Saturday, and I want to read one part of that paragraph one more time for emphasis. On Saturday, the front page of Kenya's biggest newspaper, led with the headline, Kenyans in China, rescue us from hell, as a member of the country's parliament called for Chinese nationals to leave Kenya immediately. TV stations in Uganda, South Africa, and Nigeria also ran stories on the alleged mistreatment. The fallout continues to the fallout threatens to undermine China's diplomatic efforts in Africa. One moment, fam. I accidentally clicked the link to a different article and it changed on me, so now I have to go back to the old article. My bad, fam. 1 second. So the fallout. No, see every time. Oh God, there's so many damn links. It keeps redirecting me every time I get back to the article. But anyway, the fallout threatens to undermine China's diplomatic efforts in Africa. In recent years, African nations have become key diplomatic and trade partners to Beijing, with China's trade with Africa worth $208 billion in 2019, according to official figures from China's General Administration of Customs. And now I'm skipping a couple more paragraphs, so one moment. In recent days, no, sorry. But in recent days, African governments have been quick to demand answers from Beijing on the treatment of their citizens. On Saturday, Nigerian lawmaker Oloye Akin Alabi posted a video on Twitter of the Chinese ambassador to Nigeria, Zhao Pingjian, being grilled by a Nigerian politician over the mistreatment of Africans in Guangzhou. During the exchange, Zhou was made to watch videos of Africans allegedly being mistreated in China. Oloye accompanied the video with the message that his government would not tolerate the maltreatment of Nigerians. So peep that, fam. He did not say Africans. He did not say black people. He did not say the diaspora. He said Nigerians, a nation in China. The governments of Uganda and Ghana also reportedly summoned their respective Chinese ambassadors over what the Ghanaians called the inhumane treatment being meted out. Meanwhile, the Foreign Ministry of South Africa, which is currently chairing the African Union, said it was deeply concerned by the reports. On Saturday, and perhaps the most serious sign of continent-wide discontent, Musa Faki Mohammed, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, tweeted that he had invited the Chinese ambassador to the African Union to personally discuss the allegations of mistreatment. And fam, so that's all I have to read from that article. But as you can see, these African governments had no problem speaking up for their citizens. And in many of the cases, these governments are making sure that they're speaking up specifically for their citizens. These are governments stepping up for Africans who are being mistreated. Now, as we know, African Americans are Africans who have been mistreated for centuries. Yet we get very, very rarely spoken out for, and with nowhere near the speed and quickness do we get spoken out for by African governments the same way they're speaking out for their own citizens. So this flies in the face of Pan Babblers claiming that the reason why African governments don't speak up for African Americans is because they're controlled by the white man. Because, first of all, the so-called white man's control of many of these countries has been not fully and not in every country, but in many countries has been replaced or mostly replaced by the Chinese so-called control of these governments. Actually, to the point where there are many American and European news corporations, and you can easily Google this, who are putting out articles because they don't want to be replaced, because we know that America and Europe were doing their colonialism debt traps and their neo-colonialism debt traps with Africa and still are. But these American and European news corporations have been putting out many articles, so-called warning Africans of the debt trap diplomacy of China, and it is something to be cautious of, and Africans should not be so willing and open to China the way they are. But the reason why America is so-called, and European corporations, news corporations, are putting out these articles and have been putting out these articles, so-called warning Africans, is not because they care about us or care about Africans and is trying to just genuinely warn them, but because they don't want to be replaced as the debt trap colonialists by China, which is what's happening. So the white man supposedly stops the African government from speaking up for African Americans, but it can't stop the African government from replacing them with China. And now that many African countries have already replaced America and Europe with China, the Chinese government, who's supposed to now be in place of the white man, because remember, this is not a so-called African government. That's what the Pan Babblism told me. African governments don't exist. They're all ran by outside forces. So these African governments who are now supposedly being ran by the Chinese government the same way they were being ran by the American and European governments, all of a sudden have the balls to speak up against China that they never had against America and Europe. And why is this the case? Oh, because as I read an article, and that's why I emphasized that line where I read Kenya's biggest newspaper, the African people of these countries are pressuring their governments to stand up for them. That's the difference. The African people and the African populace does not pressure the African governments to stand up for African Americans. But they do pressure their governments to speak up for their own people, regardless of what business is going on or what so-called financial reliance Africans feel that they have on China. The people stood up. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to put a link in the description box of a video of a former African politician who's speaking about this Chinese situation. And she's talking about how many of the citizens sent her videos and sent her messages expressing concern about the treatment of Africans in China and putting pressure on her to stand up and say something. She spoke about it. Well, she didn't really say they were pressuring her, but she was saying that they put, they were sending her messages and videos and stuff. So basically, she's admitting that she's responding to the concerns of her people. So this excuse about how the African government can't do it because of their fear of America, that may be true. But what's being shown by this China virus situation is because we know that Africa has the same fear of the Chinese government, or upsetting, or had the same fear for the most part of upsetting the Chinese government that they do of upsetting the American and European governments. They have pretty much the same fear because they don't want to lose that business partner, right? Which is the same fear that they had of America. Obviously, that and invasion, but China could technically invade a lot of these African countries too, um, if they felt justified enough. So, um, long story short, there's not really any difference. There's small differences, but not much of a huge difference between the relationship between Africa and America and Europe, and the relationship between China as it is now. Obviously, in the past, there's a different colonial relationship and all that other stuff. But for the most part, outside of the past, right now, the relationship between Africa and China and Africa and Europe and America, it's not that much different. But the two main reasons why these African governments spoke up for African citizens and their mistreatment in ways that they will not speak up for African Americans is because A, these people are actually their citizens. That's why the Nigerian politician was specifically addressing the treatments of Nigerians. So A, it's because it's their citizens, their actual citizens, and whether Pan Babblers like it or not, we are not citizens of Ghana or Nigeria or anything else. Hell, half of us can't even get passports to these countries, let alone citizenship. Whether they like it or not, we are technically citizens of America, not Africa. Because if Africa was just this great place that the Pan Babblers claim, we would have birthright citizenship to Africa the same way we have birthright citizenship in America. Especially since America is so much worse compared to Africa, and if we think America is going to do anything and benefit for us, we're so crazy and stupid. So since Africa has so much more likelihood of doing something for us and being a place for us to be, why don't we get birthright citizenship with them? But anyway, I digress. Um, they're speaking up for their citizens. The African governments are speaking up for their citizens, number one. But number two, they're also being pressured by their citizens. And that's really even the bigger cause, other than the fact that these people are just their citizens, is that they are getting pressure from their citizens to do something. Because they know that if they just sit there and sit on their hands, they will be exposed as totally illegitimate governments, and they will create the seeds for a revolution in their overthrow. So they know when they are pressured by their people to stand up for their people, they better do it, or they're not going to be in the positions that they're in much longer. And they know that. So the risk of ignoring their people, the risk of not pleasing their people is greater than the risk of not pleasing the Chinese, because they won't even be in position to be the ones taking money from the Chinese, which is what they're scared of, if their own people overthrow them. So I'm saying that to say, and again, I'm going to post a video to the politician also talking along with the article, talking about how she got messages from African people to say something and speak up about what's going on in China. These African people do not put that same pressure on their governments to attack America for its treatment of African Americans. And because of that, that's why we have to have the movement that we have. Because we are not citizens of these countries. These countries will not embrace us as citizens. So we can, if we're going to have to fight a government, really, we shouldn't have to fight any government for our rights because we're humans, and that's just what there's a such thing as human rights. So we shouldn't have to really fight any government for our rights and what's due and what's owed to us. But if we're going to have to fight a government, the government that we should fight is the government that we're actually citizens of, because that's a fact. Whether Pan Babblism, I'm speaking in facts, not conjecture and fantasy and fake flags, fake RBG flags that don't represent any nation. I'm speaking on reality. Whether Pan Babblers like it or not, we are citizens of America. I am a citizen of America. I have a birth certificate showing that I am a citizen of America. I'm not a citizen of Nigeria. I'm not a citizen of Ghana. I'm not a citizen of South Africa. I'm not a citizen of Ethiopia, etc. So if I'm going to have to fight a government for my rights, I have to fight the government that I'm actually a citizen of, rather than fighting a government that I'm technically not a citizen of for rights that they can easily say I'm not entitled to because I'm not a citizen of their country. So you pan babblers can babble, because that's why I say it's babble, and that's why I call you pan babblers, because it's babble when compared to the facts. You can babble about how we all Africans and we all the same, and how we should call ourselves African and not call ourselves American. We should refer to ourselves as Africans before we refer to ourselves as Americans. As a matter of fact, we shouldn't even say we're African Americans. We should just say we're Africans. We should just disavow all connections to America. It's just a white supremacist, imperialist, hellhole, blah, 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 blah. As much as you want to babble that, the reality is that I can't go to Nigeria and say I'm an African, therefore I'm a citizen here. I can't go to Ghana and say that. I can't go to South Africa and say that. Because legally, it's not true. It's a lie. It's a fantasy. It's babble to say I'm a citizen of those countries just because I'm black and because we all Africans and we all the same. I can't go to Jamaica. I can't go to Ghana. I already said Ghana. I can't go to none of these countries. I can't go to Haiti and say I'm a citizen there because I'm black, despite what Pan Babble ideology says. So if I'm going to have to fight a government for my rights, it's better to pressure my own government because that's the government I'm going to have the most impact on. Even with the example I gave about the African citizens, I didn't say the African citizens should pressure America to treat us right. I said they should pressure their government to pressure America. African citizens whining to America is not going to have much impact because they are not citizens of America. They are not constituents of American politicians. So they would have to pressure their own governments to pressure America, not directly pressure American governments. And if they're having their own issue, it would be better for them to pressure their governments about their issue rather than pressuring America about their issue that they're having with their own government. Because it's their government. And that's why they're pressuring their government. These African citizens, they didn't pressure America to speak up for Africans. They pressured their governments to speak up for Africans. So the pan babblers are further exposed because we see what could happen if these citizens chose to speak up for us the way they choose to speak up for themselves and their mistreatment of their own people in other countries. If they saw us as their own people, but they don't, and we know they don't, which is why we have to deal with things the way we do. And I do want to say this as a quick caveat. I don't say these things because I hate Africans or Caribbeans. As I've said in past videos, I'm dating someone who is of Caribbean descent. I've said before, I used to be a Pan-African. I still do want Pan-Africanism to someday become true, meaning that I do want someday where black people are on code all across the globe, and that we do see each other as basically the same people, and we do understand that all these other groups, white and otherwise, are against us because we're black and don't see the differences that we see among each other. They don't see Nigerian versus Ugandan. They don't see African American versus Caribbean. They don't see Caribbean versus African, African American versus African, African American versus Caribbean. They don't really see those divisions. In America, they kind of do see those divisions, which is another reason why the FBA and ADOS movements had to come into play. But overall, in the big picture, they don't see the differences. So I wish that we will get to a place one day where we don't see the differences between each other. I do want us all to be unified like that. But the reality is that's not the case today. And we can't operate or function as if that is the case. We have to just make it happen if we want it to be the case, where all of us are unified. So, Pan Babblers, instead of sitting over here in the so-called imperialist hellhole collecting your stimulus check and unemployment from the American government that will do nothing for black people, why don't you pick yourself up, and instead of sitting here begging the government for resources from the white man's economy, take your behind, your pan babbling behind over to Africa. Because remember, the contrast is don't go to America, don't rely on America because America will do nothing for you. And the contrast is that Africa, if you join the Pan Babel movement, will eventually do something for you. So that's the movement to be a part of. That's their contrast and their whining and their complaint. So since Africa is the place to be, why aren't you, instead of sitting your behind up in America, take your butt to Africa instead of sitting your butt in the country that will do nothing for us and is the white supremacist imperialist hellhole that we should not lay any claim to? Instead of being in a country that you're too ashamed to lay any claim to, why don't you go to a country that you can be proud of, like an African country? And actually put together, since you, and also because remember, we just do nothing but talk and do things like I'm doing now, which is make YouTube videos. So since we do nothing but talk and you do all the work, take your butt over to Africa and get the people to create a movement where they will pressure their governments to stand up for African Americans and reach out to African Americans and provide tangibles and resources to their lost and stolen children. Since that's what we are. And since that's what we should be calling ourselves, that rather than descendants of American slaves. Why don't you do that? Because remember, y'all do all the work and we do all the babbling. We do nothing but talk. So why aren't you over there instead of sitting your butt up in America continuing to fuel the white supremacist imperialist economy that will do nothing for us and that we should be so ashamed of that we shouldn't even claim to be citizens of the country? And we should be ashamed of our heritage, of our American heritage. And we should disavow it and call ourselves Africans. Since we should do that, why are you in this country that we can't even, we should be ashamed to even call ourselves citizens of? Why are you still here? You have work to do because remember, you do all the work and we do all the talking. So I'm going to sit here and talk in America and you get your butt over to Africa and do the work like you claim you do and get these governments to stand up for us the same way they're proving that they can stand up for their own people. It's simple. It's easy. End of story. Because you see, fam, you see the Pan Babblers, they thought after we had a dispute with ADUNS, the ADUNS organization, that, you know, some of them tried to come back around. And I would recommend, fam, that some of y'all go back and listen if you haven't already heard it. My video, Beware the Return of Pan Babble. And they thought that there was an opening to come around and say, hey, have you rethought African ideology? Or ADOS because now that you've fallen out with them. And I told them then, and I'm just going to reiterate, no, I haven't rethought it. Because the ideas and the reason why the movement took a hold with so many people are still valid. Just because certain agents within the movement have been proven to be suspect and have alternative motives, suicide down ballot motives, doesn't mean the ideas that attracted people are now invalidated. Just like when the UNIA had infiltrators and people who had alternative agendas take it down, it doesn't mean that that movement was now discredited. Just because the Panthers had agents and stuff in it doesn't mean that the ideas of the movement are now discredited. Even though some of them to me are discredited, not all of them. Like the food programs and stuff, that's not discredited because they got infiltrated. the Nation of Islam, because they've had so many disputes, countless disputes, probably more disputes than any other pro-black movement. Because there's still 3 or 4 Nation of Islams other than the one that's led by Minister Farrakhan to this day. Not to mention the stuff that has gone down with Malcolm X or Khalid Muhammad. They're not discredited, and their do for self ideology isn't discredited just because they've had divisions. So neither is the descendants of American slaves' ideologies, because we're still in this situation. We're still abandoned by our African countries and our African governments. And many of you pan babblers would rather intellectually masturbate and read John Henrik Clarke books in America rather than walk the talk and take your ass over to Africa, since they are not doing on their own and you're the big hard workers, and get them to do the work to reach out to us and provide refuge to us, so we don't have to rely on this white supremacist hellhole, and we don't have to quote unquote beg this white supremacist imperialist hellhole to give us reparations. Give us somewhere else to go instead of whining and crying up under us about how we're stupid and foolish because we don't intellectually masturbate and read Cheikh Anta Diop and John Henrik Clarke while espousing no new original thoughts, just repeating and regurgitating what our great scholars said while adding nothing new to the conversation and giving us no new strategies and doing no work, despite your claims that you do so much more work than ADOS and FBA. Because if you were doing so much work, you would walk your talk and stop sitting up leeching off the white man's imperialist economy and take your ass over to Africa and get them to put pressure on their governments to reach out to us and make their governments reach out to us, since their governments have so much more of a chance of doing for us than America. And we should be claiming to be citizens of their country by calling ourselves African, even though all these countries have their own individual names, and there are Ugandans and Nigerians, and a Ugandan is not a citizen of Nigeria. Yet we should go over there with some all Africa mentality, because that's way better and way smarter. And we should be running around here with some all African mentality, calling ourselves generalized Africans with no nation. We can't call ourselves Nigerians or Ugandans or Ghanaians. We just got to call ourselves generalized Africans, and we can't even claim our own country. Since that's the case, and since we're foolish for claiming our own country and asking for reparations for our own country and refuge and resources, why don't you get the African governments that we are supposed to be proud of to actually do something for us and give us something to be proud of? But again, fam, I say this again, not all Africans, not all Caribbeans are bad, not all of them are against us, not all of them are off code, but too many are. And until we get more of them on code with us, or until you pan babblers get more of them on code with us, so that pan babble becomes pan Africanism again, because it used to be pan Africanism when Marcus Garvey and those people were leading it. It was pan Africanism. But once we've gotten into today's age of pan Africanism, it's become Pan Babblism, and you guys are going to need to do the work to make it pan Africanism again. Just like Donald Trump says, "Make America great again." I need the pan babblers to make pan Africanism great again by getting these countries to reach out to us and give us refuge. I'm still cool, and I say that to say I'm still cool, and I'm still respectful of individual Africans and individual Caribbeans. I don't hate them as people, and I don't want them to go down or suffer or be mistreated. But at the same time, when it comes to political movements and social movements, I'm putting Black Americans first, because nobody else will. But anyway, fam, that's another video. Like, share, subscribe, and peace.